So ever since the leaks that the slime characters were going to get a buff, I've been thinking that it's a good possibility that we might be getting a slime collab part 2, especially with the second part of the second season of Slime airing very shortly. So today I've got a bit of speculation on what those units might be able to do. Hello all and welcome to the channel. My name's JB and today I'm going to be giving you a few ideas of what a Slime part 2 collab could look like with my custom collab ideas. I've done one of these videos before but with Xenoblade instead, so if you've missed that and want to watch that one first, go check it out, a link is in the description. Also a big thank you like last time to BeatsPH again, as once again this video wouldn't have been possible without his assistance. So make sure to go sub to his channel as well if you haven't. Another link for that is in the description. Finally, before we jump in, according to YouTube, 96% of people that are watching my videos aren't subscribed. Subscriptions are absolutely free, and the best thing is that if later on down the line, whether in this video or another, you start to think I'm annoying, boring, or I've sold myself out, then you can hit the same button to unsubscribe. So everybody, I ask of you now just to quickly hit that red button before we carry on. Done that? Well then let's get right into the video. So what should be a surprise to no one is that to start off this video we're looking at Rimuru. But the difference with this one is he's now a true demon lord. Now the only point I really want to make on that is that Rimuru will still be classed as an unknown race when the info bar comes up. Simply for the fact of, I'm not sure where the classification falls. Technically in the slime universe, he's a demon slime, which I believe still makes him part of the slime race, which is still make him unknown. But worst case scenario, I'm wrong and now Rimuru's a demon, and that could make him a lot stronger when you consider Assault Meliodas with all of his stats that we're about to see. So let's jump right into it. The obvious first thing to note is that this Rimuru is a red unit, because we've of course already got a blue and green Rimuru in the form of the previous Rimurus from the part 1 slime collab, so we're finishing it off with the red one. And before we get into his moves and skills, I just want to add a quick note that due to where the anime is, some of the art isn't an exact representation of the abilities, and I'll also have to explain what some of them mean. As an example, with the first ability, Stormbreak, hasn't been featured in the anime. So for explanation wise, I'll be reading directly from the Slime wiki. But before looking at his skills, we'll take a quick look at his passive, Wisdom King Raphael, which is obviously the upgraded version of Great Sage. Here what it's doing is for each buff and debuff on the field, it will increase all of Rimuru's stats by 3%, which is stackable up to 10 times, giving you a maximum possible stack of 30% of all of your stats. Now this is where if he's a demon, he could get a little bit ridiculous alongside Assault Mode Meliodas, once we take into account his skills and the debuffs applied onto all enemies. But anyways, we'll start off with his skills. I'm going to start with his second skill and I'll explain why in a little bit, which is Gluttonous King Beelzebub. This is an extort ability, a new one in the game, which inflicts damage and then extorts all 3 enemies for their basic stats. Now this ability is stackable, meaning you could have multiple debuffs on the enemies which procs his passive, meaning he'll have the potential to get max passive on his own. Now 20% might seem like a high value to get stacked 3 times for a total of 60%, but this is a level 3. For level 1 and 2, it'd only be 5% for level 1 and 10% for level 2. And damage multiplier wise, it's the same low multiplier as SR Gila's Ignite card, which is 80% for level 1 and 120% for level 2. So on the lower ranked cards, he won't be stealing that many stats and won't be dealing that much damage. Beelzebub is also fortunately one of the abilities that was recently shown in the anime, so there'll be a clip on screen to show you what it looks like now. It's the upgraded version of Rimuru's existing Gluttony. For his rank 1 skill, we have Stormbreak, which inflicts shatter on one enemy, which is mainly his damage card. Now I've selected shatter because you'll be stealing the enemy's defense anyway, so charge as an example wouldn't make much difference. However, shatter in combination with taking the enemy's defense should allow you to deal a large amount of damage, bypassing their 2 defensive stats. The description of Stormbreak is a combination magic and art move inspired followed by Hinata's Melt Slash. Rimuru uses Storm Magic from the Storm King Veldora ultimate skill, which is scarier for its secondary damage rather than its primary. Once it opened up a wound, the destruction would begin from there, eventually breaking down your entire body. It is a sure kill art that ate into its target's life force. Basically, it's a slash which then, by the sounds of it, bursts dark flames or wind or storm magic, whatever that is, out from the wound, dealing extra damage. So this would have multiple hits in it for sure, giving you a few opportunities to crit. And finally, his ultimate being Megiddo or Megdido, however it's pronounced, I'm not entirely sure, which is an AoE flood ultimate. It uses the damage value of the Shatter AoE ultimate, so Skinny King's ultimate, as a reference, and is based on Rimuru's ultimate skill. This again was recently showed in the anime, and the moment that I think most of us saw it, knew that this would be an ultimate if this came through into the game. I've also just given it Flood just to be even more ridiculous and deal extra damage. Not that it'd need it in the first place, with how much damage this Rimuru will more than likely be able to deal. And finally we have his stats. Now this is the only thing that's really changed from the Xenoblade video that I did on this topic as well. Instead of giving all units a 490% stat total, I've gone with 500% instead of 10% buff, so they'll all be slightly more powerful. But when designing Rimuru's stats, I had to make sure that they weren't over the top, because of course his passive at max would scale drastically with them. That said, he does automatically have a large amount of lifesteal, so it will be quite difficult to take down, and once his passive is active, he should be critting a lot and dealing a lot of critical damage. It's safe to say that if this Rimuru was ever added into the game, he would be a monster. Or possibly what I should have said is a true demon lord. Anyways, moving on to the next unit, and we have Ranga, one of Rimuru's closest buddies. This is also a very good example of where I couldn't find any art. I'm looking at you, Shadow Step stance kill, so apologies for the poor artwork. It's custom made and it's the best that I could do. But what I lack in art skills, I hopefully make up for with creativity. So let's have a look at his kit. Ranga is a green unit and is another unit based around damage over time. This is especially obvious when looking at his passive, absorbing 30% of any damage over time damage, which is dealt to the enemies. Now the value 30% might be too high when you consider that he might heal for poison, bleed, shock and corrosion damage. But those are numbers for developers who get paid to make video games for a living to sort out, so for here it'll do just fine. Ranga's first skill is a single target shock card, which deals pretty decent damage and of course has the shock effect, allowing him to stack this off of his passive and provide a stable source of healing for 4 turns. This skill is already technically in the game in the form of Slime Rimuru, as his ultimate is technically the same thing, but this is part 2, so this can just be a weaker version for the sake of argument. Pretty simply as well in terms of the description of the skill, a black lightning bolt comes down from the sky and strikes down, and I can just see Ranga howling into the air whilst the lightning bolt comes down and strikes a single enemy and deals some pretty neat damage. However, where Ranga gets really unique is with his second skill, the Shadow Step stance. At level 3, Ranga assumes a stance for 2 turns which inflicts damage and inflicts bleed for 2 turns as well when any ally is attacked, and during the stance as well he takes 50% reduced damage just to make him a bit bulkier and a bit tankier. Now this is only 2 turns at level 3, at level 1 and 2 it's 1 turn and will deal 100% and 200% damage, and not only that but the reduced damage will also scale as well, with level 1 having 10% damage reduction and level 2 having 30%. Now Shadow Step is a fairly universal skill in terms of the slime universe, however particularly what I envision the skill looking like is very similar actually to the Gobta versus Gabiru fight, where Ranga will hide in his own shadow on his side of the field, and then whenever one of his allies get attacked, he will appear behind the enemy from their own shadow and give them a quick bite and then disappear back into his shadow. And this will also be useful just to deter enemies from attacking, as whichever way they do it, they're going to end up providing Ranga with a source of healing and begin taking some damage over time as well. That said, however, the damage values aren't particularly very high on the skill, skill, so you won't be dealing loads and loads of damage through the bleed. Next, we'll take a quick look at his ultimate, which is Death Storm, an AoE release attack like Winged Elaine. Once again, this is just a raw damage ultimate, which will stack very nicely with his own skills and passive. Specifically as well, the skill was shown in the anime, showing a huge set of tornadoes, with the enemies being sucked into them and then being shocked to death at the end, which is what you can kind of see in the art there, which will just be an awesome finisher. His stats are also pretty decent. He doesn't have very high HP related stats, due to the fact that he doesn't really need them thanks to his passive, but he has decent defensive stats, especially with crit resistance and crit defense, which are pretty average, and a high pierce rate along with a decent crit chance and decent crit damage should help him deal a lot of damage on his single target attacks and through his damage over time. At the same time though, he's pretty straightforward to counter any debuff immunity or even a taunt, meaning you can only inflict your shock on one enemy, will drastically hamper his healing potential and thus will result in him being a lot easier to take down. Moving on to the next unit, which was teased in my Xenoblade video as a transforming character. It's the man himself, Veldora, and is another very clear example of the lack of art, as he's only just been released in the anime and there's not all that much fan art for me to use for him, unfortunately. But in my opinion, for both his human and dragon forms, I do think I've done a pretty good job. But anyways, let's jump in and have a quick look at them. Starting off again with his passive, which is Storm Crest Protection. At the beginning of every turn, he will activate a stance which will deal 100% of damage when attacked, and it will grant Veldora only a shield equal to 150% of the damage dealt during the stance. Again, the damage values and the numbers might want to be tweaked slightly, but the main idea is that Veldora will do a little bit of chip damage and make himself a little bit tankier when doing so to any enemies that might want to use AoE attacks or attack him directly. And this would work like Green Dian's passive with the shield instead of a stance, meaning that if you have Esterosa on the team, he will also gain debuff immunity every single turn. In terms of his skills, we have Death Heralding Wind, which is an AoE deplete ultimate move gauge attack, which we haven't seen on a meta character for quite a while. In terms of the ability's description, it's an ability that includes both Storm of Destruction and Black Lightning. All of the surrounding organic matter is gathered into a big sphere, the ground becomes a cleared surface due to the corrosion effect of the wind, all of the germs crawling on the ground and all organic matter are ejected into the sky. A huge black storm sphere is completed, and the target who is inside is shredded to small pieces by the corrosive blades of wind and by the small thunderbolts made of lightning. So the way I envision this skill is kind of like Noelle using her magic in Black Clover at the beginning where she's losing control. It'd look something similar to that, but we'll just have to wait for the anime to catch up and see if that's actually what it's supposed to look like. And for his second skill, we have Killing Art 1. The Killing Arts are a fighting style that Veldora himself designed whilst being stuck in Rimuru, reading through the manga that was in his memories. And so he designed a fighting style around of the things that he saw in said manga. And so that's also going to be one of his cards. This move cancels stances and is actually the same card that Jenna has, so it cancels stances on all levels of the card. We don't have any meta units which cancel stances, and more stances are becoming meta. Veldora's got his own stance here. I've just gone through Ranga, who has a stance, Esterosa, the new Excalibur Arthur, and so this ability definitely wouldn't go amiss. And then finally, the most important part of him, which is his Storm Dragon Summon Ultimate, where he undergoes a transformation for 5 turns, fully restoring his HP, and he fills enemies' ultimate move gauge to the max, which sounds a little weird, but bear with me. He'll then prevent the use of ultimate moves, which initially I thought of should have been 3 turns, but potentially could be 5 the duration of the ultimate, and increases his basic stats by 5% for each orb filled. This is actually pretty much the opposite of what BeatsPH did for Issei in his High School DxD collab. However, Issei reduced ultimate gauge, where here we're filling it. And there is actually some benefits to doing so. If they don't have a cleanser immunity, then the enemy will basically lose 3 cards every turn, which will be filled by their ultimate moves, which is a different type of problem altogether. It also pairs really nicely with his AoE reduce ultimate move gauge card, because in worst case scenario then, if all enemies had ult, you can at least get 15% basic stats and prevent their ultimates. Once you've transformed into Dragon, however, you've got a lot more power. His new passive, True Dragon, prevents any skill effects from applying onto all of your party, which actually already exists in the game in the form of a debuff for Chandler and Mark II Valenti. The difference is here, however, it doesn't act as a debuff. So buff cards will still work, but any attack cards will have their effects removed. So it can quite easily cook Asariel as an example, preventing him from critting with his Sever card, whilst Veldora will be able to deal mad damage with his Storm of Destruction, which is the replacement for his AoE card, which deals detonate damage. If Purgatory Bon is anything to go by, then this is a pretty powerful skill, especially when all of your enemies will all be locked at max ult level, giving you basically double damage for free. You've then got your single target Wing Blade, which has Sever, which is also just there to deal high amounts of damage and make good use of your high crit damage. Storm of Destruction has a pretty straightforward description as well, just being basically multiple tornadoes in a wide area dealing lots of damage, whilst the description for Wing Blade's a little bit more complex. Veldora's wings generates vibration and turns it into a high frequency blade. The vibrations of the two pairs of big and small wings creates a death end barrier which could tear molecular bond. Veldora's large build gets covered with death end barrier and becomes a huge destruction sphere. Basically he cuts with his wings and they deal high amounts of damage. And then finally you have his ultimate, which is Storm Blast, which is the standard transforming ultimate, which is basically a converged emission of Storm of Destruction, travelling at speed over Mach 100,000 using invisible waves. The effect only manifested after a delay. It is practically impossible to prevent the effect from the storm since the target has already received the blow. It's impossible to dodge or defend. Pretty good for an ultimate move. His stats are also pretty decent, with good crit resistance, a decent crit chance and crit damage, and average remaining stats. He doesn't have a ton of lifesteal however, so it could be possible to overwhelm him with damage before or after the transformation. I'm also pretty certain of his best team, which would consist of Veldora, Ranga, Blue Festival King and Esterosa in the back. Both Veldora and Ranga would be able to take advantage of the debuff immunity, whilst Ranga and King both apply damage over time debuffs. With all three active on a unit, the enemies will be losing ultimate gauge, which will power up Veldora when he gets his ultimate. Once transforming, Veldora will have the damage to deal huge blows to the enemies, whilst also protecting his allies from excess damage thanks to his passive. He could also be pretty confidently countered as well though by Assault Melee teams, as even though you won't get the Rupture and Amplify effects of Assault Meliodas, he will still deal mad damage, and he'll still be able to gain the buffs from his ultimate. Green Zeldris would also be an excellent counter as well, as Green Zeldris would be able to debuff all of the enemies, sealing their ultimate and taking away ultimate gauge. So there is still definitely counterplay there to the team, but out of all the units on this list, Veldora is definitely my favourite. And finally we have the last character, which is Diablo. He's been featured quite a few times through the anime in his own little segments, but as recently at the end of Season 2 Part 1 made a full appearance. In terms of in-game, he would be a red unit, and he'd be the only unit on this list which I can confidently say is a demon. And in terms of that, we've got his passive Primordial Demon. Reduces the max HP of all enemies in battle by 10% for each ally of a different race. And then the bonus effect of that, because you might not ever get much value, is applies any debuff applied onto this hero onto all enemies. So if you debuff Diablo, he'll apply that same debuff, whether it's bleed, dissolve, or any debuff onto all of the enemies or the units that applied it onto him. That is excluding demons though, because it would be a bit ridiculous with Assault Mode Meliodas for just attacking him. We've also got two brand new cards. Firstly, starting off with Demon Skewer, which inflicts duplicate damage, which uses the last skill effect applied for his own damage value. How this works is, if on the enemy's turn, the last skill used was the one's Super Slash, which has Flood, and you use this skill first on your turn, then this skill will also inflict Flood. Vice versa though, if you're facing a Rimuru that I went through earlier and he uses the Extort, then your skill will inflict the Extort, and it works like such. So it might have a bonus skill effect, it might not do depending what happens on the last turn. And then the second skill is Anti-Magic Area. If you didn't notice from his passive and this skill, I've designed him partially to be a counter to the Purgatory Barn team. He cancels stances and buffs, seals ultimate move gauge, and decreases damage dealt by 50% for 2 turns, meaning you can remove Arthur's stance, you can remove Barn's buff, seal everyone's ultimate gauge so Barn can't ult and get his passive up, and you decrease his damage, specifically his damage and not his attack stat, as his passive cleanses attack lowering debuffs. That in combination with his passive, if used properly, could help a lot of you take out Barn. Finally, his ultimate is the same as Ludo's, which is Black Destruction, which is just a random ultimate that I came up with, as there's not a lot of abilities that I could find on Diablo unfortunately, which just deal a lot of damage to all enemies and create a barrier, providing a bit more utility and protection against Barn's Detonite skills. And then in terms of his base stats, he's also pretty good with a hefty amount of lifesteal to keep him sustained. And that's all the units that I'd like to see in a part 2 collab. In terms of the story event and boss, I think it'd be very interesting to see the attack of Foltra, which is seen at the end of season 2 part 1 as the main story, and instead of attacking the Jura Forest Federation, they end up accidentally heading their way to Leonis and going to attack there instead. So the 7 deadly sins come into help. And in terms of the boss battle, we can have a battle against Clayman, which is what the main focus of season 2 part 2 will be. So I've got no information here unfortunately to provide you on what sort of abilities or magic you can use, and therefore what type of boss battle it'll be. We'll just have to sit here and wait. But that's all for my That Time I Got Reincarnated as a Slime part 2 collab. If you've enjoyed it, a quick reminder to hit that red subscription button. I've already harped on enough about that though at the beginning of the video, but another quick reminder again for BeatsPH. If you haven't subscribed to him, make sure to do that right now as well. Again, these videos wouldn't have been possible without his assistance. But until next time guys, peace!